With the inauguration of Franklin Roosevelt comes a new attitude toward what to do about the Great Depression. He referred to it as giving the country a new deal, and it focused on relief for the unemployed, recovery for the economy, and reform of the financial system. The new president did not wait around to study the problem. He had a mantra, if you will: action, action now, action, action now. And that became sort of his way of operating. Let's try something. If it works, great. If it doesn't, let's try something else. But above all else, try something. And that's what he did. On the day after his inauguration, he declared a bank holiday. The runs on the banks were driving banks out of business. He closed them all and then sent out inspectors to inspect those banks. Those that were found to be solvent reopened the next Monday. The ones that weren't were helped to regain their strength so that they could open again. And then he took to national radio in the first of what were called his fireside chats, where he would directly address the American people. And in that first fireside chat, he explained to the American people what he had done, why he'd done it. They'd closed the banks, and he assured the American people that when their bank reopened, it would be safer to have their money in that bank than under their mattress. And the following week, when the banks reopened, he was rewarded. There were more people putting money back in the banks than there were taking money out of banks. Now, when we get into New Deal programs, it's going to become an alphabet soup. And we don't need to memorize all of those agencies. I mean, if you write them out, it's a couple of pages, double column of all of these things that were New Deal programs. But what I want you to do when we talk about specific New Deal programs is I want you to look at them and see which of these goals they are designed to address. Sometimes it'll be just one, sometimes it'll be all three. But that would be an easy way for you to be able to organize the data. Which goal does this program address? The method of the New Deal was not some planned out step-by-step program. No, he said it was a program of bold, persistent experimentation. And if something fails, admit it and try something else. But above all, try something. So this was the method. And it's why studying the New Deal can be so confusing, because a lot of these programs overlap. They do the same thing. And so it's all an experiment. He doesn't know what's going to work and what's not, but he's going to throw as much stuff against the wall and see what works as he possibly can. That's the method of the New Deal. After he declared the bank holiday, he then sent an Emergency Banking Act to Congress. In some ways, this act, which was passed by Congress with his handwritten notes in the margin, that's how fast it was passed. And in some ways, he was making legal what he had already done. Remember, he's not waiting. He is charging ahead. Action, action now. So the legacy of the Emergency Banking Act was, number one, it restored the confidence of the American public in the banks. And it began the process of regulating Wall Street and the financial institutions by the federal government. Very quickly after the Emergency Banking Act, he introduced the GLASS-STEAGALL Banking Act. And this was another reform. It prohibited different kinds of financial institutions from owning one another. It built a barrier between the different kinds of banks. GLASS-STEAGALL was based kind of on how you build ships. I don't know if any of you have ever been on a large ship, but the area below the waterline is not just one big open space. It's divided into waterproof containment centers, so that if a leak springs in one of those chambers, it can be closed off and the whole ship doesn't sink. That was kind of the idea behind GLASS-STEAGALL, to build barriers between the different financial functions. For example, the commercial banks. This is your bank where you have your checking account, where you have your maybe your ATM, the Chase branch on the corner. These are the banks that provide the small personal banking services like checking, like savings accounts, consumer loans like car loans. That's where you would go back in those days to get those kinds of loans. The other major financial institutions were called investment banks. These were the ones that dealt with the corporations. They raised money for the corporations. They lent corporations money. They were behind corporate stock and security trades and issuing new stocks, IPOs as they have been called. And they also were involved in financing mergers and acquisitions between corporations. So these were the Wall Street boys, not the Main Street boys. And so what GLASS-STEAGALL did was it said an investment bank could not own a commercial bank, and a commercial bank could not own an investment bank. So if one segment of the banking industry got into trouble, it would not drag down the other segment. Now today you go to the bank on the corner and it's JP Morgan Chase. JP Morgan is the investment bank. Chase was the commercial bank. And GLASS-STEAGALL was repealed back in the late 80s that allowed for those mergers. But what it did was to keep the various segments of the financial industry separate so that no one segment could drag down everybody else. This was a reform to try to prevent a Great Depression from ever happening again. Another reform he brought was the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the FDIC, which anytime you walk into a bank today, they're going to have this big symbol on their door. It means that the federal government guarantees your deposits in that bank up to a certain amount of money. So in a day when banks, if they closed and you had money in them, you just lost your money. Now the federal government guaranteed that you wouldn't lose your money if a bank closed. And this was done by forcing the banks to pay for this insurance. Remember, this is an insurance corporation. And so the banks pay the premium to guarantee your money that is deposited in those banks. And the FDIC then restored consumer confidence in the banks because now the federal government guaranteed you couldn't lose your money. And so money poured into savings accounts so that people could earn a little interest. Another reform of the financial industry was the passage of the Securities and Exchange Act. It was aimed at preventing the exploitation of the leaders of the stock market. It established the Securities and Exchange Commission. It required full disclosure of the information about a stock before it could be sold. And it gave the Federal Reserve Board the power to regulate the purchase of stocks on margin or on credit. And so established here in the first 100 days of the New Deal, the Securities and Exchange Commission continues to this day to be the government watchdog over the practices of Wall Street. Now, you can argue about whether or not it's effective or not, but at least it provides laws that require Wall Street to be transparent so that if you are going to buy stock, you can get accurate information upon which to base your judgment. It also regulates insider trading. So people in the know are not the only ones who can profit. When it came to relief for the unemployed, the New Deal was not primarily about providing unemployment insurance or what was called a dole back then, giving away government money so people could buy food. They had a different approach, and that approach was to provide jobs for the unemployed through federal programs. For example, people were out of work, and so the federal government formed the Civilian Conservation Corps, which hired young men to go out and work on government property. they would be paid a wage plus given room and board, so that a great portion of what they earned could be sent back home to help support their families. It was hugely popular and built all kinds of facilities on government properties. For example, in national parks, the CCC built picnic areas, built tourist cabins, built roads, so that people could go and enjoy the national parks. One of the biggest projects of the CCC was to replant trees, reforestation. The timber industry had cut down every tree over thousands and thousands of acres. It was causing erosion problems and other environmental problems. So the CCC sent men out to replant the forests. The CCC also gave grants to the states to have things built in their state parks. For instance, here's a picture of a swimming pool that was built in Abilene, Texas at Abilene State Park. Now, was it essential that Abilene State Park have a swimming pool? Absolutely not. But men needed the work. And so not only did Abilene State Park get their facilities upgraded to make them more popular, but people got work and were able to support themselves. So this federal money goes to the states because the state budgets were drowning. Unemployment was causing a decrease in tax revenues for the states. And many states, such as Texas, have it in their constitution that they cannot go into debt. And so here the federal government is stepping in to help those state budgets to stay balanced and at the same time bring relief to the unemployed. Now, all these federal programs were putting the federal budget into a huge deficit. FDR did not believe in a big federal deficit. And so he was always looking for ways to find new revenue sources. He did not believe in going into debt, but he knew that it was necessary, so he did. But to try to offset that, he was able to get through the amendment that repealed prohibition and then slap a huge tax on now legal alcoholic beverages. And so this was a resource for the federal government. Of course, there were ardent prohibitionists who disagreed with Roosevelt and fought him tooth and nail on making alcohol legal again. But in the end, he was able to win because of the revenues that taxing alcohol could bring to the federal and state governments, rather than having it go to the bootleggers. In the area of recovery, the New Deal looked to address the problem on the farms. Not only was it the Dust Bowl, but it was also overproduction. Remember, we talked about how farmers tried to produce their way out of falling farm prices. Well, that wasn't working. Overproduction was just driving down the price that the farmers would get paid for what they produced, and therefore farms were failing. The New Deal program that tried to address this overproduction was called the AAA, or the Agricultural Adjustment Act. And what it did was to pay farmers not to grow so much, not to produce so much. And so farmers began to cut back on how much acreage they had under cultivation. They were getting paid to do that. Dairy farmers were getting paid to pour out their milk rather than bring it to market, to try to drive up the prices for farm products. Now you have a couple of unintended consequences here. Number one, this was not a very popular act with people who were hungry, who could not afford food. And so to see the dairy farmers, for example, pour out milk when they needed milk for their baby was not very popular. Secondly, it shows one of the horrible weaknesses of the New Deal. The New Deal tended to focus on production, not on demand. If, for instance, that money they were paying to the farmers to not produce goods had gone to people who needed to buy goods, then the farm prices would have gone up. But that's not what they did. So one of the big weaknesses of the New Deal programming was too much emphasis on the demand side of thing, on the corporate side of thing, on the owner side of thing, and not enough focus on the demand side, the consumer side, to try to address the problem of overproduction. Another side effect of AAA was it began to kill agricultural jobs for people like sharecroppers. Farming had been primarily gang labor, particularly in the South and in the cotton fields, where they would use the sharecroppers and the croppers' families to go out and plant and cultivate and harvest cotton. But now if the farmer who owned the land was getting paid by the federal government not to grow so much, he didn't need as many sharecroppers. In fact, many farmers would do things like, if they, say, had 4 sections of land that they were farming, 3 of which were farmed by sharecroppers, and he personally farmed the 4th section, then he would fire all the sharecroppers, let 3/4 of his land lie fallow, collect money from the federal government for doing that, and then he would farm his 4th section and make a profit on that. So it drove many farm workers off the land and created unemployment, particularly in the South. AAA also boosted the mechanization of farming, so that now the farmers would buy machines to harvest their crop rather than using gang labor. For instance, in this picture, you have a cotton picking machine that replaces all of those workers who had previously done the picking of the cotton. That leaves those farm workers out of work. The centerpiece of the New Deal was known as NRA. This was a program which tried to get companies to collective bargain for salaries, tried to provide public works jobs to create increased buying power for workers. And there was a huge publicity campaign basically telling the American people, if a company or a restaurant or a store does not fly the NRA Eagle, you should not patronize that store. And this created problems for the small store or company, because to get the NRA Eagle, you had to agree to abide by a growing list of federal codes and regulations. Among those codes were that you could not cut wages. You could not lay off people. And for the small owner, that was a problem. Because if there was not enough demand, say for your restaurant, then you had two choices. You could either go out of business, or you could abide by the NRA codes that you'd agreed to get your poster. Some of the most famous cases of this are small businesses who decided to stay open and break their code agreement with NRA and were later punished for doing so. There was one tire shop, and I don't remember where it was, but it was kind of like a discount tires, if you will. And they sold and repaired car tires. Well, he agreed with NRA, he signed the pledge to abide by the codes, that he wouldn't cut wages, he wouldn't lay off people. And then business did not pick up. And so he was faced with a situation where he had to either close his doors or break his agreement with NRA. He went to his workers and he said, "Workers, which would you rather have? I've got two choices. I've either got to close the store, which means you're out of a job, or I need to cut your pay in hours," which violates NRA, but I can stay open and you still have some income. The voters voted, or the workers voted to stay open. And so he cut hours, he cut wages, stayed open. The workers still had some work to pay the bills, and NRA came after him for breaking the code. So NRA was not good for small business owners. It was much better for major corporations who had a hand in drawing up the conditions for NRA. We talked about reform in the financial industry, but there were other areas that the New Deal tried to reform. One of these was the electric power industry. At this time, electric power was primarily owned by private corporations, and they could set whatever rates they wanted to charge their customers. And because they were private companies, the federal government had no way of finding out if they were charging a fair price for their electricity. And so one of the programs of the New Deal was called the Tennessee Valley Authority, or TVA. They put people to work building dams along the Tennessee River. Many of these folks were sharecroppers who had lost their gig on the farm and needed work. And they moved in to work on these big dams. They were hydroelectric dams. So the federal government owned plants that produced electricity. And the reform part came in that by having their own plants, they could have a baseline for how much it costs to produce and distribute electricity. Then they could go and look at these private power companies and say, hey, you are gouging your customers. You're charging too much. And so they could set regulations on how much these private companies could charge. In other words, reform to be able to provide more affordable electricity to the people. So TVA built all of these dams primarily throughout the South, creating reservoirs and helping to prevent flooding, creating electricity, which could then go to help the surrounding communities by providing electricity to them, and most importantly, providing jobs, particularly in the South where so many had been displaced with the decline of the sharecropping system. So with the construction projects of TVA, you really have all three of the R's in one program. You have recovery, in that the private electric companies would not distribute power, would not distribute electricity to rural areas because it was not profitable enough. They had a formula. They had to have X number of customers per mile of wire. And if they didn't have that, they just didn't provide electric service. And so the vast majority of rural areas were dark. They had no electricity. And so the recovery part of this was now the federal government could sell electricity to people in rural areas that were not served by the private power companies. It was reform because they could now set rates and know if the power companies were charging a fair rate, and if not, regulate the rates that the power companies charged. And finally, it was relief. As thousands of people were able to get work and support themselves working for this government company, TVA. When the initial surge of the New Deal seemed to be having some positive effects, critics emerged. Some of them for political reasons, some of them for philosophical reasons, but you had people come out against Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal. This was one of his favorite cartoons, showing a boy writing his name Roosevelt on the front walk, and the little girl screaming, "Mommy, Tommy wrote a dirty word." Now, undoubtedly, these were corporate people. This family was a part, perhaps, of the banking industry, who believed that Roosevelt was violating their ability to be unfettered in doing business. And he was. He was regulating business. He believed that one of the functions of government was to make sure that businesses were fair. And so he was not upset by the criticism. In fact, in his second term, he directly challenged corporate America. And he remained hugely popular with the people, but not so much with the corporate leaders. In fact, one of the jokes he would tell was about a man who was walking along a lake, and he saw a man out in the lake drowning. And he threw off his coat, jumped in, and pulled the man out of the lake and saved his life. And then when the man was recovering on the bank, he looked up at the guy who'd saved him and started cussing at him. "Why'd you save me? You so-and-so and so-and-so. Why didn't you save my hat?" Well, Roosevelt felt like that drowning man who was so unappreciative was like the banking industry. Roosevelt believed that he had saved the banking industry, the financial industry, from ruin. And now they were being ungrateful and cussing him because they hadn't saved his hat. Conservatives saw this interference, as they saw it, of the New Deal in the way that business was being run as some kind of socialist plot, that the federal government was trying to take over business, was trying to control business. And so they criticized the New Deal as some kind of socialist conspiracy. But the New Deal also drew criticism from people who were more liberal than Roosevelt was willing to be. People like Senator Huey Long from Louisiana. He started Share Our Wealth clubs across the country. Make every man a king. What Huey Long was wanting to do was redistribute the wealth. He was wanting to take the money away from the rich people and redistribute it to average Americans. And his plan was hugely popular. And so it was a threat to Roosevelt going into the 1936 presidential reelection. For Roosevelt, fortune intervened, and Huey Long was assassinated in the halls of the state capitol of Louisiana that he had built, and is still the state capital of Louisiana in Baton Rouge today. But these attacks from the left end of the political spectrum that Roosevelt was not doing enough. At the same time, he's being attacked from the right wing or the conservatives for doing too much. The best known of the radical critics of the New Deal was Father Charles Coughlin. He was a radio minister, had millions of listeners every week, and he was a socialist. Every time he called Roosevelt's name, he'd call him Franklin double-crossing Roosevelt, because he believed that Roosevelt had promised to make the United States a socialistic country. That was not Roosevelt's intent at all. He was a capitalist. But he believed in restrictions or putting up guardrails to stop the abuses of capitalism. But that wasn't good enough for Charles Coughlin. And so he would rant about how Roosevelt and the New Deal had violated its promise because it did not made government control business. Another critic of the New Deal for not going far enough, for not being radical enough, was a dentist by the name of Francis Townsend. He wanted the federal government to begin a retirement plan. And in his vision, what the federal government should do is just pay everyone who reached a certain age, like 65, a retirement plan, a dole. Roosevelt saw this, and this is a great example of Roosevelt the politician. In response to Huey Long's criticism about not redistributing the wealth, he got Congress to pass what was called a wealth tax that increased the amount rich people had to pay in federal taxes. So indirectly redistributing the wealth. In the case of the Townsend plan, what he did was he found a way to provide retirement insurance. He was afraid that if he just had a dole plan like the pension plan, that all it would take was for Congress to cut off the funding, and that would kill the plan. So think about it. What did he come up with to undercut Townsend's plan politically, but provide some of the same help to the American people? That's right, Social Security. Social Security is an insurance plan. You pay into it while you're working, and then you collect it when you stop working. And because it was an insurance plan that you were paying for, then Congress could not cut off the funding and end the plan. So this was his strategy to not only politically undercut the supporters of the Townsend plan, but also provide a federal benefit for the people, particularly in retirement. Roosevelt's use of the radio as a political tool, his so-called fireside chats that became must-hear radio for millions of Americans, allowed him in pretty common language to explain to them what he was doing, what his programs were designed to do, how he was addressing their needs. And so the use of the radio as a political tool was proven by Franklin Roosevelt. Now, I don't want to confuse you with all this alphabet soup stuff, but there was a PWA that was struck down by the Supreme Court. So what the New Deal did was just reinvent it and change its name, called the WPA. And its purpose was to provide jobs for people who were rebuilding the infrastructure of the United States. And so there were literally thousands of WPA projects around the country that provided work for the unemployed and provided infrastructure, if you will, or improvements for local, state, and national areas. So through WPA, they built some roads, they improved some others, they widened them, as in this case. They put men to work building, and women, building for America. I don't know how many of you recognize this. This was a WPA project in Dallas that became famous later on. Look at it, see if you can figure out what it is. That is DEALEY Plaza, famous for the assassination of President Kennedy, from that red brick building there, the school book depository. Now, did Dallas need some kind of a plaza? No, but men needed the work. Fort Worth's Farrington Field has been in the news recently because the school district is trying to sell it, but they're having trouble because it was a WPA project and therefore is a historic structure. And so they're not sure they're going to be able to sell it. So providing stadiums was another part of the WPA, providing jobs by building those stadiums. Building schools, like Arlington Heights High School. Now, a lot of these projects maybe were not building the entire structure. Some of them were. Some of them were just improvements or add-ons. Polytechnic High School in Fort Worth was a WPA project. The WPA went in and made improvements to the Fort Worth Botanic Gardens. If any of you have ever been to the Riverwalk in San Antonio, no, the daiquiri or the margarita shops and the Mexican food places were not WPA projects, but that cement river was. The WPA went in there as flood control and banked the San Antonio River to prevent the town from flooding in the spring rains. And so you can thank the WPA if you have enjoyed margaritas and tacos along the Riverwalk. Texas wanted to build a monument to Texas independence, the Battle of San Jacinto, and the WPA built it, taller than the Washington Monument in Washington, D.C. Now, did Texas need a big old monument? No. But people needed the work. And that's what WPA was all about. Not frivolous things, but providing work by building new structures. And they built roads and improved roads to meet the demand of the growing automobile traffic. And they were not shy about advertising where the money came from for these projects. In most of these buildings, I would assume, for example, someplace in Polytechnic High School, you would find a plaque like this. Someplace at Farrington Field, you would find a plaque like this, that it was a Works Progress Administration or a WPA project. And this happened all over the country. It's not just in Texas, it happened everywhere, all over the country. The WPA built hundreds of post offices, but they went further than that, because they paid artists. They hired artists to go in and paint murals on the walls of these post offices. Now, does a post office need a painted mural? Absolutely not. But artists needed the work. Actors needed work, and so they created the Federal Theater Project that paid playwrights to write plays and scenic designers to make scenery and costume people to make costumes and actors to act and directors to direct. Some very famous people came out of the Federal Theater Projects. And they would take these shows on the road and perform them around the country for a small price so that the general public would get to enjoy theater. They also began a radio broadcast, a precursor to PBS. Writers were out of work too, and so they created the Federal Writers Project under WPA, where the federal government hired writers. The most famous outcome from these writing projects were state almanacs. Each state put together an almanac about its state. And they were, in many cases, remarkable books covering the history of the state. And in fact, the Almanac for Texas even included things like slave narratives. They found old folks who had been slaves, and they interviewed them, and so we have a first-hand account of what it was like to be a slave in Texas. Another of the projects that were undertaken was to preserve American culture. And so groups of writers and recorders went out. Some would have a recording machine in their car, in the trunk of their car, and they would hear people back in the mountains of Appalachia, or people down on the Delta singing the blues, and they would stop and record them. This was the beginning of the Smithsonian Institution's cultural archives, and preserved many of the old ways when it came to American culture. So while the WPA was providing work and providing construction, improvement, and reconstruction for infrastructure, another agency took on the reform and relief by providing relief in the form of jobs and recovery. Remember, I said that the private electric power companies would not distribute power to rural areas. Well, the New Deal saw this and created REA, the Rural Electrification Administration. And they were going to string wire and bring electricity to every household in America. That was their goal. Now, much of this did not happen until after World War II, but rural electrification, and with rural electrification came improved health, improved production. For example, now a dairy farmer in a rural area could have electric milking machines for his cattle. And in rural areas where they did not have running water, they did not have indoor plumbing, now they could pump water into the house and pump the discharge out of the house, because now they had electricity. So it brought rural America into a more modern lifestyle, a healthier lifestyle, and integrated the country through a common use of electricity. As corporate America turned against the New Deal because they saw it as interfering with business, a breaking of the laissez-faire tradition, Roosevelt turned more and more to helping labor. And the passage of the Wagner Act in 1935 gave labor something that they had been looking for decades. It allowed and made legal labor unions. It allowed those unions to collective bargain. In other words, to have the union do the negotiations with management over wages and working conditions and that sort of thing. He also got past a minimum wage, which had been a goal of the labor movement since it had begun back in the 1870s. And so with these kinds of acts, Roosevelt was helping to build the labor union and the labor movement in America as the corporate side turned against him. One of the things that the New Deal did to help labor unions was to form the National Labor Relations Board. This government agency would oversee the conditions of labor and would intervene if the labor unions were not being treated fairly by the corporations. Now, I mentioned earlier how Social Security was political in that it undercut the movement of the Townsend Plan. But it also showed Roosevelt's desire to leave permanent structures, because Social Security is an insurance plan. It's not something that's funded by Congress. You pay into it while you work, and then you receive the benefits when you retire or when you're disabled. And so it's a self-generating source of money. It doesn't require appropriations from Congress. Now, you may have heard recently, oh, Social Security is going to go broke and all this kind of thing. Well, one of the reasons that it has some money flow trouble is because Congress borrowed money from the Social Security Trust Fund, and they have not been able to pay it back. It's part of the national debt. So if Congress would repay the money they borrowed from Social Security, Social Security would not be in any kind of trouble in the immediate future. And that's what Roosevelt had envisioned, an insurance plan run by the federal government, something that Congress could not interfere with. The challenges to New Deal programs took the form of lawsuits as corporations and others began to try to stop New Deal reforms and restrictions. And when those cases got to the Supreme Court was very conservative, and they began to strike down New Deal programs like the NRA and the AAA as unconstitutional. Roosevelt was really, really mad about this. He felt like the corporate interests were trying to regain control. And so he proposed a solution. Up until this time, he had not appointed any Supreme Court justices. Supreme Court traditionally has 9 justices. That's not set in the Constitution. And so what Roosevelt proposed, and what became known as court packing, was legislation that would increase the number of Supreme Court justices from 9 to 11, I believe it was. Thus, he would get to appoint 2 new Supreme Court justices and would have a majority on the court, so they would quit ruling his New Deal programs unconstitutional. But court packing went a little bit too far even for some Democrats. And he never could get it through Congress. And so court packing failed. And in retrospect, we can see that that is kind of the moment that the New Deal began to lose its momentum. And there were still New Deal programs, but more and more the attention of the federal government would have to turn to developments in Europe as Adolf Hitler rose to power. Some saw court packing as Roosevelt's attempt to become a dictator, to stop the one area of the federal government that was resisting the New Deal, and that was the court. And so some came to picture Franklin Roosevelt as an aspiring dictator. So what was the result of all these programs, of this New Deal? Well, unemployment did go down. In fact, Roosevelt thought that things were going so well in 1937 that he agreed to a tax increase to try to pay off all the debt that had been run up with his programs. And when he did that, the economy immediately went into another recession and unemployment went up. And he responded by cutting taxes again. So the New Deal did not solve the Great Depression. Roosevelt recognized that there were inequalities in New Deal programs. His wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, who often were his eyes and ears out in the country because the polio prevented him from being particularly ambulatory, she pushed him to include particularly African Americans in his New Deal programs. But Southerners controlled a lot of the legislature, and they were strict segregationists. And so politically, he could not do what perhaps he wanted to do, and certainly what his wife was pushing him to do when it came to programming for African Americans. And yet he had a vision for the future. And that vision was about economic rights. And he proposed employment for everyone, an end to unfair competition, to medical care. And so his second Bill of Rights that never got passed, but became the basis of Lyndon Johnson's Great Society in the 1960s, becomes his attempt to see more equity in the future. So in evaluating Roosevelt and the New Deal, was he a socialist who was trying to take over businesses and have the government run American business? Was he against capitalism? Or was he, as critics from the left said, the new Hitler? Someone who wanted to be a dictator and would only go along with what business wanted him to do. The reality is he was a capitalist who was trying to steer the country to maintain a democratic republic and a capitalistic nation, but with guardrails, with certain regulations on business that prevented their excesses. He saw those excesses as what had caused the Great Depression in the first place, and believed that the role of the federal government should change to where it became the umpire, the one who enforces rules on business. And in such, some people have called the New Deal the Third American Revolution, after the original revolution with George Washington and after the revolutionary impact of the Civil War and the Reconstruction Amendments. So What was he? And what was the New Deal? In summary, he was a little bit of everything and not enough of some things. There is no doubt when we talk about the impact of the New Deal or the results of the New Deal that it changed the United States forever. It preserved American capitalism and democracy. But most important, it changed the expectations of the American people for their federal government. Before this, people did not expect much from the federal government. But after the New Deal, the people of the United States expect the federal government to be working for them. For example, the federal government as responsible for the economy. When other economic downturns have happened, people have not questioned, should the federal government do something? The question has been, what should the federal government do? Before the New Deal, the question was really, should the federal government do anything? After the New Deal, the American people came to see the federal government as a regulator, something that was going to keep the economy fair and be sure that they were not being exploited by corporate America. As a result of the New Deal, the American people came to see the government as something of a guarantor, a provider of a safety net, someone who would provide minimal protections, like for their savings in the bank or for their retirement with Social Security. And so the real change was not the programs of the New Deal, but what the American people emerged after it expecting from their federal government. And Franklin Roosevelt changed the expectations of the American people, what they expected from their president. They expected a person who would be warm and attractive, who they would like personally. They expected a leader, not a follower. The president as the head of the government. A far cry from what the Founding Fathers had originally thought, that the president was simply an administrator carrying out the will of Congress. The American people expect the president to be active, to not just sit back and wait and see what Congress does, but to drive Congress, to drive the government. And finally, the American people came to see the president as the media spokesperson for the federal government. All of these had happened occasionally in the past, but after the New Deal and after Franklin Roosevelt, the expectations of the presidency had changed in the minds of the American people.